Hello, everybody. I'm Jacoby. I am on the steer committee of the Now Movement, and I am excited to be here today to introduce a guy that in my brain is my best friend, right? And I don't know if that's real to anyone else, but have you just studied someone or been around someone, heard so much about someone, and you're like, that's a cool person. They're my friend. And then it's weird when you meet them because it's like, we've had all this time together, but there really has not been. Well, that's me and Prof. Rah right now. So easy to know that we're besties. You're invited to the cookout. So before we introduce him, I do want you to know that we are going to have a brief Q&A session when he concludes. And so get ready to get those things together. If something comes up in which you want to ask a question about, feel free to type it in the chat box. My good buddy, Jeff Stark, is going to give me those questions, and then we'll talk to Prof. Rah about that after he concludes for a brief moment of Q&A. Again, welcome. Thank you for joining us so much, and we're excited that you're here. We're excited that he's here. As Althea said, we stand in total agreement with the intercessory prayer and the great words that Althea said about the situation which he's in, and pushing forward and doing what he's called to do, and that shows great conviction. I'm super excited about this. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce him. Now, his full bio will probably be in the chat box because God has given him so mightily that I tell you, if I read it all, we'd be here all day. And one of his videos that he wrote, he made a joke about how his wife told him not to write a book on lamenting because no one wants to read about lamenting. And he said he saw that truth because of the way it sold. But I tell you what, brother, that book was so great. I read it in a night, 229 pages of wonderful My Heart song, You Are Now My Spirit Animal, by the way. So let me get to this introduction. So Reverend Dr. Soong-Chan Rah he works as let me make sure I get it. He's the church growth and evangelism at North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois, and the author of such books as The Next Evangelicalism, Many Colors, Prophetic Lament, co-author of Forgive Us, Return of Justice, and Unsettling Truth. And again, his full bio is going to be in there, but everyone calls him, and he's my friend, I call him Brother Rah, but everyone else calls him Prof. Rah. And with no further ado, my brother, it's to you.
Thank you so much. Very, very kind introduction. And thank you for many who I know had heard about what's been happening in my family and praying for our family. And yes, my mom passed away yesterday. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But those of you in the faith know what it's like, that it can be a very joyful, it's obviously a sad moment, but it can be a very joyful moment when someone who all her life has put her faith in God and faith in her Lord, and to be received in the arms of glory, it's actually a very, very beautiful moment. And that's what my family experienced yesterday. So I just flew back yesterday, so very glad that the timing worked out. And one of the reasons I wanted to make sure to be on this conference call was that I think my mom would have been very upset at me if she had known that I was canceling an opportunity to share and to speak. So I wanted to make sure that we were able to get this time together. I wanted to honor the Nazarene connection that I have. I don't know how many of you know, but I served at a Nazarene church when I was in seminary. I was part of Cambridge Church of the Nazarene in Cambridge, Massachusetts. My senior pastor was John Bowen, who went on to pastor the Lamb's Church in New York for many years. And John was just a very dear friend and mentor and pastor to me. I actually stayed at his house for a couple of months during the time that I was in seminary. And then I actually lived in the basement of the Church of the Nazarene. And so I've spent a lot of time in the Nazarene church. In fact, when I planted the church, our church didn't plant as a Nazarene church, but back in 1996, when we started the church in 96, it was actually started at the Church of the Nazarene building. It's actually in transition now, but has been there for 25 years. So just a real long relationship and connection, and in my case, a very deep, profound thankfulness and gratitude for the Nazarene Church. I don't know if Fletcher Tink is on the call, but Fletcher is another dear friend and mentor who has been someone within the Nazarene community. Michael Mata, another person from the Nazarene community that has been a dear friend and mentor. So I'm thankful for this chance to share with this community as a community that has personally influenced me in a very positive way. Now, obviously, we know right now that this is just this incredible convergence of these challenges. I was saying the other day that in the 20th century, you had three catastrophic moments: the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, and the Civil Rights Movement. And these were like decades long, or they kind of dominated a decade, and they were separated by decades. But here in the 21st century, in the year 2020, they are occurring simultaneously. An incredible economic collapse, of course, tied in, of course, to the pandemic, but of course also the civil unrest that we have experiencing. Three catastrophic events that are usually spaced out in the course of an entire century are occurring simultaneously. So the question is not, are we in a crisis moment? That's not even a question. We are in a crisis moment. We're in moments where, in crisis moment where injustice kind of is more evident in times of crisis. Disparities and inequality become more evident in times of crisis, and we are certainly seeing that now. So the question is not, are we living in challenging times or in a crisis moment? That's, again, unquestionable. The question is, what's the church going to do in this moment? Will the church step up? Or, as I'm going to challenge and say, oftentimes in the past, the churches haven't stepped up. The church instead ran away and hid when these challenging moments arose, when these difficult circumstances arose. The church didn't step up. The church instead ran away and hid. So how can we, as the Christian community now, in the midst of all these moments that are occurring around us, how can we embody and practice and live and demonstrate a theology, demonstrate an ecclesiology that is appropriate for the crisis moment that we're in? I think we can articulate it. We've got a lot of seminaries that are supporting this, which means, and I've known through the years, and I've really appreciated the Nazarene emphasis on education. The Nazarenes have done really well in terms of like ENC and Point Loma and all these wonderful colleges that are Nazarene colleges because of this very high emphasis on education, and to have several seminaries indicates, again, this real high emphasis and concern for education. So I think, everybody on this call will be able to articulate an ecclesiology or articulate a theology during these times. But the real question for me is, will we live it? Will we practice it? Will we demonstrate the gospel, not just proclaim and talk about the gospel? And so if you look at slide 2, I don't know if somebody can put slide 2 up there for me. In slide 2, I talk about a process of developing practical lived theology. This originally comes out of the work of Holland and Henrio, who are Catholic theologians here in Chicago, but it was modified, and I learned this from my mentor, Eldon Villafane, who is a Pentecostal ethicist that I learned from at Gordon-Conwell Seminary. And he outlines these three categories: clarification, conceptualization, and confrontation. Clarification in that first step is to understand the world that we're living in. What is our social, cultural, historical reality? And I think this is just an important exercise for all churches and even pastors to engage in, to say, before I speak up and say something, I really need to know who I'm speaking to. It's like if you're a missionary and you go into a community and you don't know the language, or you don't know the context or the cultural value systems, you're probably not going to get a hearing. You probably won't be heard. And so this first step is important, that we understand the world and the times that we're living in. John Stott, who actually is quoting Barth, John Stott used to say that preach with a Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other hand. So that's a very important image of how we, as God's people, and clearly in a broken world right now, how can we speak the gospel into this broken reality? So it's important for us as Christians who want to demonstrate the gospel and proclaim the gospel to know the context and the reality of the world that we're in. The second area is conceptualization, and the key word there, of course, is concept. What are the theological concepts? What are the biblical truths that we begin to speak out into the world that needs to hear this message? Now, people hear this and say, oh, are you saying that you need to make up concepts that fit the context? No, actually, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that most of us already have these theological concepts in our minds. We've gone to seminary, we've read the books, and of course, in the very rich historical, theological Nazarene tradition, most of you have these theological concepts, concepts of holiness, concepts of righteousness and justice that are already in the narrative of the Nazarene movement and Nazarene denomination. And so most of these theological concepts, the biblical truths, especially around things like holiness, such a beautiful image for the church to pursue. Those are important theological concepts that you already know, but what you're trying to do is begin to speak those truths into the context. So the truths of holiness might have a different application now than it did maybe 300 years ago when the world was very different, right? So even 10 years ago, the world was very different. So we're not changing our theology. We're just trying to find a way to make sure that our theology is being received and heard in the context and the historical social cultural reality that we're in. The third category is confrontation. And you have to use the word confrontation to have the nice alliteration, the preacher's alliteration. But the idea is more, what do we do about this practically? So if you don't like the word confrontation, try to come up with another C and email me what a better C word might be than confrontation. But the idea there is we want to do something about this. We know there are needs in our social, cultural, historical reality. We know these biblical truths that call us to action, that call us to a theology and ecclesiology that calls us to movement and action. Now, what are we going to actually do about it? And that's the confrontation stage. What are the ministry practices? What are the spiritual practices? What are the biblical applications, the methods, the lived theology that we want to demonstrate? The way very real on the ground ways that we do this. So this is a very basic standard approach to say, how do we move theology from way up here to the ground level? And by the way, if you want to use this template as a sermon, that's fantastic. You begin with an introduction that says, this is the world we're living in. And then you go into the theological truths, the biblical exposition, and then you talk about the application and say, and many of us preach this way. This would be a very practical theology to say, this is how we want to speak the gospel and preach the gospel and demonstrate the gospel in our times right now. So I want to do this in kind of a sample form by looking at the Book of Lamentations. And by looking at the Book of Lamentations, I hope we get a little sense of how Lamentations gives us not just a theological kind of conceptual theology, but actually a real on-the-ground theology. How do we begin to apply this? So let's take a look first by looking at the context of the Book of Lamentations. And we read about this in Lamentations chapter 1. Verse 1, how deserted lies the city, once so full of people, how like a widow is she, but who was once great among the nations. She who was a queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Look at the three positive words there. Once a city full of people, once a great nation among other nations, once a queen among the provinces. But that was a past reality. And the current reality when the Book of Lamentations is being written is that the city now lies deserted. Instead of a great nation, that it's like a widow, abandoned. Once a queen has now become a slave. So this gives us a little snapshot into the context of why the Book of Lamentations is being written. Most of you know it, of course, that Israel had once been a great nation, a queen among the provinces, under especially king like David and Solomon, that we know, this nation that had been built up, favored by God, promised land, God's chosen people. But we also know that the subsequent kings after David and Solomon, even starting with Solomon, they rebelled against God. They started worshiping idols, and they started disobeying the commandments of God. And so God had to bring punishment upon the nation of Israel and his own people. And we know that the northern kingdom was wiped out by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom gets wiped out, and the only thing left is actually the capital city of Jerusalem. And eventually Jerusalem gets wiped out, and Jerusalem is wiped out by the Babylonians. And then, of course, we know that they were sent away into exile. And we see this in Lamentations chapter 1, verse 3. It says, after affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations, she finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. This, of course, is a description of what happens to Israel after they have been conquered by the Babylonians. they are sent away into exile. And you know the story of exile. Exile was actually the learned who were taken away, mostly the men, if not all men, the prophets, the priests, the kings, those who could read or write, those that the Babylonians said, you know what, this group might be able to rebuild Jerusalem. We don't want to leave them in Jerusalem. So we're going to send them into exile into Babylon. And of course, we know the story of Daniel and his friends who are in exile because they were young, probably on their way to become leaders in the community. They were taken away and they were taken to Babylon. So the only ones left in in Jerusalem actually, would have been the widows, the orphans, the sick, the crippled, the lame, the blind, the sick. The most marginalized, the most disenfranchised of the community would have been the ones that were left behind. And they're the ones, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, they're the ones that lift up the lament, the most oppressed, the deepest victims of this injustice, the most disenfranchised, marginalized, and the suppressed and oppressed group. They're the ones that are left behind in the city of Jerusalem. Now, given this reality, given the fact that they have lost their promised land home, they've lost their identity as a nation, they've lost their homes, they've lost their families, they've been disconnected, obviously fathers separated from their wives and their children, leaders separated from their communities. This is the lowest point in Israel's history. And I want to talk about three potential options. If we can put that slide up, slide number 5. I want to focus, though, on the first option and the third option. There are three potential options that they could have responded to what was happening with the exile. The first potential option is to run away and hide, to give up. After all, they've lost everything. They've lost the battle. They've been conquered. They have nothing left to fight for. So just give up and hide. The second is to say, well, we lost to the Babylonians. Let's just adapt to the way the Babylonians do things. We've lost to them. They've conquered us. So we're not going to follow Yahweh anymore. We'll just do what the Babylonians do. We'll follow their gods because they've defeated us. So we're going to give in to the Babylonian conquerors. And then the third option, which I will advocate for, is to actually say this is the sovereign move of God. And we will worship God, not in a triumphalistic way, but with the proper and appropriate response of lament. And lament is the appropriate liturgical, ecclesial response to the reality of suffering that is in the world. And that's what I'm going to push us towards. But let's unpack that first reality, the social reality of the people of God after the exile. The first thing they're thinking is, all right, we've lost, so let's just give up. And we see Jeremiah respond to them and say, actually, you're not allowed to do this. We see this in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 4. It says, this is Jeremiah writing to the exiles. So this is what the Lord Almighty, the God, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. So he writes this letter to Babylon. And he says in verse 5, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, the next slide, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters, increase in number there, do not decrease. And if you can go to slide number 9, verse 7, also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Now, which city is that? It's Babylon. Now, if you think about this in the biblical context, 99.9% of the time you see the phrase seek the peace or seek the shalom, the word shalom, and a city is mentioned. The city you mention is, of course, Jerusalem, which makes perfect sense. So 99% of the time, seek the peace of Jerusalem is a very common phrasing you see, except in this incident. You see the phrase, not seek the peace of Jerusalem, but seek the peace of Babylon, which when the exiles in Babylon are hearing this, they're thinking, Jeremiah, have you lost your mind? You said before, seek the peace of Jerusalem. David has said, seek the peace of Jerusalem. All the psalmists and all the prophets repeatedly say, seek the peace of Jerusalem. And then now Jeremiah tells us to seek the peace of Babylon. And you got to remember Babylon and its kind of symbolic theological representation. Babylon is Vegas and Hollywood and Wall Street and Washington, D.C. all rolled into one. It symbolizes all the evil that exists in the world. And yet here comes Jeremiah and he says, seek the peace, seek the shalom, not of Jerusalem, but of Babylon. And he even says, live your life, continue to live your life. continue to be God's people, even though you're in Babylon. The lesson for me that I draw out of this is even when God's people are confronted with the worst case scenario and the absolute most horrific reality, we are never, ever allowed to give up and run away and hide. And so when we are confronted with challenges and we're confronted with all the different things that make us want to run away and hide, God's people aren't allowed to do that. In fact, the call here in Jeremiah is you don't just seek the peace of Jerusalem when it's easy to do that. When David is king and Solomon is king, oh, it's easy to seek the peace of Jerusalem. You don't just get to do that. You also, as God's people, seek the peace of Babylon. And that's one of the challenges that I want to raise to this gathering, that we have been given the challenge not only to worship God in the good times, but worship God in the challenging times. To not only bring God's truth to bear when it feels right to do so, when we feel like, oh, isn't it wonderful? America's this great Christian nation, and we're doing all these great things for the kingdom of God, and America's wonderful, and America's great. But even when things are difficult, in fact, that's when maybe God's people step up the most. And we bring, of course, God's truth into that broken reality. God's hope, but also God's lament. I will say that in the past, that's not been the case. There's been places where that has happened. But in the past, what we've seen in church history in the U.S. in particular is that when difficult times arise or when challenging times arise, the response is usually not, let's rise up and, proclaim and demonstrate the word of God more. The response is usually, let's run away and hide. What God says not to do, what Jeremiah says not to do in chapter 29 is oftentimes what the church has done. And the example I give is the early 20th century. When in the early 20th century, there were a lot of changes that were going on. In fact, the holiness movement comes out of that. The changes were our society was changing, American society. Some of that was geographic changes and demographic changes, meaning that African Americans from the South started moving after the Civil War, passed into World War II, started moving in very large numbers to urban northern cities. So leaving Mississippi, Alabama, and started moving into Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago and Detroit. So a lot of the African Americans post-Civil War all the way into the 60s and 70s started moving in very large numbers. It's called the Great Migration. There's pretty well documented history on this. At the same time, you're getting influx in urban centers in the north of Eastern and Southern European immigrants. So these urban centers in the north had been centers of Western white Protestant Christianity, Anglicans, but also Scottish Presbyterians and German Lutherans and Swedish Lutherans. And so it was Northern and Western Europeans, but then you started getting, again, post-Civil War with industrialization, the influx of Italian Catholics and Greek Orthodox and Russian Jews and Eastern European Jews. And then, of course, simultaneously, you get this migration from African Americans from the South to the North. And so the cities, for a while, were viewed as a city set on a hill, this wonderful place where the light of the gospel will go forth. But as the demographics of the cities began to change, people began to use the cities in kind of non-Jerusalem language. It's no longer Jerusalem, where the city will be the light of the gospel going forth. It's Babylon. And that's when people began to run away from the cities. They run away from the cities and leave the cities and start moving to the suburbs. A lot of Christian colleges end up in the suburbs. A lot of seminaries end up in the suburbs because the city is a wicked and evil place. It's where the ethnic minorities are. It's where the non-Protestants are. It's where the African Americans have moved in, and the Latinos are moving in, and the Asians have moved in, and these, the Jews and the Eastern Europeans and the Catholics and the Orthodox, they've moved in. So we've got to go and find New Jerusalems, and oftentimes in the suburbs. And what I noticed is that during this height of the great white flight, as its historians have noted, of whites leaving the city to move into the suburbs, you saw a lot of architecture. If you can put slide number 10 up, you saw a lot of architecture that looks like this. And I noticed this because it was in the 1970s, and my church was dedicating a new church building. And it looked exactly like this. And most of you, if your building was built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, have a sanctuary that probably looked like this. And you'll see the slanted roof and the buttressing, and then a little bit of an arch on the side. Now, I was about maybe 8, 9 years old at this building dedication of a church building that looked like this. And I knew as an 8-year-old, this is a really stupid idea. I don't know whose idea it was to build a building like this, but this is just stupid. Because an 8-year-old knows that on a cold January day when the building was being dedicated, the heating vents that run along the floor, what happens to heat? It rises. Hot air moves up. And so you literally have the frozen chosen in the pews and all the warm air up in the rafters. And an 8-year-old like myself knew this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen, to build a sanctuary where the people are freezing to death and all that warm air is up there. So I'm thinking whose stupid idea was to build a building to look like this? And the senior pastor gets up and he starts speaking. And he says, it was my idea to build the building to look like this. And then he said, I want you to picture this entire church building turned upside down. We go to the next slide. Think about this whole church building turned upside down. Can we go to the next slide? And if you look at the church building turned upside down, he says, what do you see? And he says, you're looking at the bottom of a ship. Our sanctuary is a ship. And he goes on to say, where in the Bible do you read about a really big ship? Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark. And he said, we are a church that is Noah's Ark. Now, on one level, I get it. But on another level, it's indicative of this non-Jeremiah 29 paradigm, which is not seek the peace of the city, but find yourself an ark and hide. And so what you end up doing is many of our churches ended up being arks, where we go and we hide out in the arks. And so we build in our arks, in our churches, a little bit of the word out there. We just kind of build a version of it in our ark where we're safe, where we can protect ourselves. So if you've got that evil secular art, you've got good Christian art on the ark. If you got evil secular education, hey, we're going to do good Christian education on the ark. You've got evil secular music, we'll have Christian music. It just won't be as good as secular music, but we'll have our own Christian music. Secular coloring pages, Christian coloring pages, secular lingerie, Christian lingerie, secular t-shirt, Christian t-shirts. Whatever's out there in the world, we'll make a Christianized version of it and live here on the ark. And what happens is that we have done really bad evangelism from the ark. Because instead of bringing the gospel into the world, we pull out 1 or 2 people from the ark, out of the waters into the ark. And so we grow by pulling people out of the judgment waters of God into the safety of the ark. But the world actually continues to, in our eyes anyway, be not worth saving, not worth even thinking about. And this becomes the dominant way of viewing the world in the 20th century. I mean, you see this in the literature of Christian, and especially evangelical Christian literature. D.L. Moody said, the world is a wrecked vessel. And my goal is to just save people, as many as out of that wrecked vessel, without realizing that that's maybe not what needs to happen in the 21st century, because is the Jeremiah exilic Lamentations paradigm a more appropriate parallel to what is happening in the 20th century? Not that we run away and hide in the ark, but that we actually proclaim and demonstrate the gospel into a world that is flooded with so much destruction and evil. Is it time for the church to speak into that brokenness? And so I'll offer one of the ways that we can do this, and that has to do with the Book of Lamentations and the authorship and the uniqueness of the authorship of the Book of Lamentations. There's been questions about who wrote the Book of Lamentations. And historically, traditionally, scholars have attributed to the prophet Jeremiah. And it's pretty basic kind of logic reasoning to say Jeremiah. Because, as I said earlier, when the exile occurred, all the learned and the prophets were sent away into exile. And Jeremiah, we know historically, was one of the few that were left behind. Jeremiah was actually allowed to stay in Jerusalem because in his writings, he writes about the judgment of God is appropriate. So therefore, let's give in to the judgment of God and let the Babylonians conquer you. So they said, Jeremiah's on our side. So he would have been, if not the only, one of the very, very few literate people who were left behind in Jerusalem. So Lamentations, the book, is well written. It actually clearly shows a literary style. So it was not written by an illiterate person, in other words. So if Jeremiah was maybe the only literate person left, then Jeremiah must have written down the words. It must be his writing. Here's the problem. as scholars began to complain as well, but compare the writing of the Book of Lamentations, the style, with the writing style of the Book of Jeremiah, which we know Jeremiah wrote, they said, whoa, hold on a second. The writing style of Jeremiah and the writing style of Lamentations are way, way different, just completely different. The way I've described it is compare Shakespeare to Kendrick Lamar. I don't know if this audience is appropriate to say Kendrick Lamar. All right, good. Bob Dylan would be another, maybe a more culturally relevant in this category here. But compare the writing of Shakespeare and Kendrick Lamar or Bob Dylan. Both are great writers, right? I mean, both are really good writers. Kendrick has a Pulitzer Prize. Both are great writers, but they probably are not the same people. Can we get an amen on that? Kendrick and Shakespeare are probably not the same people. And so we're talking about two very different styles. The styles are so different, there's no way it's the same person. That's what's kind of the comparison to Jeremiah and Lamentation. Styles are so different, it can't be the same person. So what's the answer? So in my research, what I've kind of walked through is Jeremiah goes to the city gate. Now, the city gate is the town hall of Jerusalem. That's the way it is in the olden days, where they would gather around the city gate for news. And obviously, when they go to the city gate, all the leaders are gone. And so, but people have to speak. People have to express their grief and what's going on. And actually, Jeremiah is probably the person who should. He might be the only learned person. He's a prophet. But it isn't Jeremiah. Jeremiah doesn't speak. Who speaks? The widows, the orphans, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and the sick. The only ones left behind are the ones who are the marginalized and the disenfranchised and the ones that have been usually pushed to the margins. And Jeremiah, the learned prophet, actually kind of moves out of the way. He's the educated one. He's the literate one. He's the person with power and privilege, to be honest with you. And he doesn't speak because he makes space for the marginalized voices to speak up, for the voices of the oppressed to be heard, and particularly women, particularly the widows. I actually argue that Lamentations may be the most feminine book of the Bible, maybe even more than Ruth and Esther. And if there's an important lesson, we should probably hear the voices of women more in American Christianity. This is a good time to raise up the voices of women. But the beautiful image here is the privileged person moves out of the way so that the marginalized, the oppressed voices rise up. This is an important moment that's happening right now. We're in this midst of just incredible oppression, incredible chaos. And it really is the time to, not for the privilege to speak, not for the powerful to speak, maybe even not even for the learned to speak, but it really is a time for the marginalized and the very least of our brothers and our sisters who've been hurt the most by this. Our African-American communities, our Latino communities, our Native communities, they're the voices who have to speak up. So I'll close with this illustration. As I said earlier, my mom passed away yesterday. My mom's been just incredible inspiration in my life. She's an incredible prayer warrior. And some of you know that I do a lot of these conferences. And when you do the conferences live, I go, to these places all over. And when I was a pastor for 17 years. I was really extroverted. I love conferences. I would try to meet everybody and talk to everybody. When I became a professor 15 years ago, something psychologically happened, spiritually happened, where I'm from an extreme extrovert to an extreme introvert. And so now when I go to these conferences, I run and hide from people. I try to find the quietest room. I don't want to talk to people. I just kind of hide from people. But what I found out is that people want to talk to you, and especially if you're presenting and ask your story. So a lot of times I get the question, because I was a pastor and I pastored a multi-ethnic church, I pastored an urban church, and a lot of people want to do that these days. They ask me, so what's the secret to having a successful church, or being a successful pastor? Now, at these conferences, 99 times out of 100, 100 times out of 100, the speakers are really accomplished speakers, no question. And, I understand that. They bring in the hotshot 29-year-old. Now, he actually, to me, he looks 40, but he claims he's 29 years old. They bring in the hotshot 29-year-old with the coolest hair, the coolest, expensive glasses, and, with beards and goatees that are just the envy, because I can't really grow and I'm an Asian. This is all I can do. So, they bring up the coolest, hippest pastors with the skinniest of jeans and the nicest of tattoos, and they trot them up there and say, this is what you need to do to be as successful as I am. Come on, we've all been there, right? You get up there, you go to the conferences, and you bring the hipster pastor with the cool glasses, the cool wardrobe, the brilliant white teeth to tell the stories of how you too can be a successful church. You too can grow your ministry. And I go to these conferences, and I get all these people saying, hey, tell me about how you be a successful pastor. And I say, I think what you probably should do is stop going to these conferences. And stop paying $200 registration fee, $300 airfare, $300 at the Hyatt, $200 for meals. You just spend $1,000 usually to hear something you probably should know or could get from a book. You go to these church planning conferences and they say, be nice to newcomers. Did I have to pay $1,000 to get that knowledge? Or you go to these church growth conferences and say, have clean bathrooms. Well, those of us in urban ministry know that that's not possible. You can't have clean and perfect, pristine bathrooms in urban ministry. So, again, I didn't need to pay $1,000 to learn how to be nice to newcomers and how to have. So I say, save your money. Stop going to these conferences, because the secret to ministry is a praying mom. Is a mom that prays for you. My mom was 88 when she passed yesterday. When she was in her 60s, she showed me the condition of her knees. And most of us have one kneecap on each knee. She has 5 kneecaps on each knee. And that's because for decades, she knelt before God on a hard wooden floor and prayed for her children and her grandchildren. And so when put your body through that, when you kneel before God, your body can't take that. Your knees can't take that kind of pressure. So in her case, her knees cracked open so that whenever she knelt before God, after decades of prayer, her kneecaps opened and would conform to the shape of the floor so that she could pray for hours with those broken knees. The secret to ministry is not writing the right book or reading the right book. It's not going to the right conference and being coached by the right person. It's these immigrant grandmothers that pray for you. It's a mom that never went to college, who in the eyes of society was actually probably the least of these. She worked for many years in a nursing home as a nurse's aide. She worked for many years as a server in a carryout in inner city Baltimore. But her prayer life and her devotion, and I say, we've got to hear those voices, the voices of the immigrant that sacrificed so much, the parents, the voices of the grandmother in the Black church who will worship and pray your heart to joy. These are the voices we've got to hear. And I would say right now in this moment where we are in this, without a doubt, kairos moment, if you want to use that word, language, this moment where we really need the church to wake up. We really need the church to seek God's heart of justice and mercy and grace for a broken reality. It's not time to hear the successful voices or the privileged voices. It's time to hear the voices of those that have been marginalized and have been maybe hurt the most. So my dear friends, thank you for letting me share my mom's story. And that this is a wonderful time to begin to seek out those voices that we have previously silenced. Gracious God, thank you for the call to be your people in a time such as this. And I thank you that you are listening and hearing, and you are speaking, maybe not through the privileged, maybe not through the powerful, but you are speaking through the disenfranchised and the marginalized and the broken lives. Their voices are the voices we may need to hear, and their voices are reflecting your voices. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Turn it over to Jacoby for some Q&A.
Thank you, man. Powerful stuff. Um, Praying mothers and praying grandmothers, man. I tell you what, I appreciate you saying that, and I know it came from a hurt place. And thank you for your truth in this meeting. Thanks for being here. I have a few questions for you, brother. I was going to be selfish and ask all of mine, but I figured I'd be nice and let other people get a shot at it. Um, so one question we have is from Ashton, and it says this: Prof. Rob, in what ways has language or scriptural terms been used in white American suburban churches to vilify people of color and sacralize or lift up themselves?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And I didn't get into this. It's a little more complex. Oh, am I muted? Am I good? Okay, sorry, it says I was muted. Okay, it's important to talk about this because what I talk about in Prophetic Lament that I would, and Unsettling Truth, which is my most recent book I co-authored with a Native American activist pastor. And one of the things we look at is the ways that narratives get embedded into our society so deeply that we act reflexively out of those narratives. So the illustration that I've been using is I love movies. My son and I are, every weekend we try to watch a movie together. We try to watch a movie together. And we love good acting. And some of the best actors are what you call character actors or method actors, where they embody the character so deeply that they can improvise and reflexively act out of that character. So the rumor is that when De Niro is playing a role, don't go near him, even when he's off camera, because he's trying to be in character. So what happened is with narratives that they get so embedded into the culture and into individual lives that we reflexively act out of them, even without thinking. And so what you're describing, the language, the vilifying and the putting down of non-whites and the lifting up of white, that's an embedded narrative and character that is so deeply embedded, it's a reflex. And that's what we operate out of. And that's why, to me, lament is such an important, and hearing these other voices is so critical because it creates an alternative narrative. It creates a different story that you begin to embody and embed. And so the problem right now is that so much of our society has embodied and embedded and internalized some of this. There are a lot of language around this. The language that is often used is white supremacy. I tend to use the word white superiority because white supremacy invokes concepts of neo-Nazis and KKK. I use the white superiority, which is the assumption that there are certain people groups that are superior to other people groups. Whites are superior to non-whites. White forms of worship are superior to non-white forms of worship. White forms of theology are superior. And there are different examples I can give. I don't have time to get into, but there are these assumptions. And that gets internalized, and reflexively and intuitively we act out of it. So that when we see, for example, African Americans worshiping in a certain way, the instinct is to say, oh, that's what African Americans do. But we don't do that because that's what the black church does, but we don't do that. Oh, and when we hear in history, the black church was out there, protesting and doing this activist work in the civil rights movement. They were led by pastors. This was a church-led movement. And then to say, well, that's the black church. We don't do that in the white church. That's a embedded narrative to say, well, the way we do it in the white church is actually superior to what's going on in the black church over there. So that's why, some of that is getting to the root of what are the narratives, the theological dysfunction that got so deeply embedded that instinctively we operate out of this. So I'll give you an example of this, and this is going to be a controversial example. When you hear the phrase Black Lives Matter, the instinct is all lives matter, you're operating out of a particular instinct. You are chafing at that statement. Now, again, one of the things that people do and need to do is to separate out the statement, the movement, and the 501c3 organization. All right. So most people say, oh, I went on the website of Black Lives Matter, the organization, and I don't like what they wrote. That is an organization that uses the name, but there is a statement that is quantifiably valued, and also a movement that is not actually embedded in the organization itself. So please note that there are kind of three different things here. So people say, oh, I don't like what the organization is doing. Yes, but you shouldn't be rejecting the phrase and the movement also, because the organization is a separate entity. It's like saying, well, I don't like, all Nazarenes because there's this one Nazarene church that was mean to me. It doesn't make sense. That's not fair to say. So anyway, so let's distinguish between the movement and the statement, the pronouncement of Black Lives Matter. So I've said this in other contexts, the phrase Black Lives Matter is a theological prophetic intrusion into a broken reality. The broken reality is, for centuries, American society has said Black lives do not matter, right? That's history. Slavery is a national pronouncement, Black lives do not matter. Jim Crow is a national pronouncement, Black lives do not matter. Mass incarceration is a national pronouncement, Black lives do not matter. So when the Spirit of God sees this, the Spirit of God says, wait, that's contrary to the scriptures. Because the scripture says, what? All lives matter. Scripture says, Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, all are made in the image of God. And so when there is a social embedded reality, this dysfunctional imagination that Black lives do not matter, then you need a spiritual intrusion to confront this evil that is in the world that says Black lives do not matter. And that intrusion is the statement, Black lives matter. That's why I say this is a theological intrusion into a broken reality. The reality is Black lives do not matter. The intrusion is the statement, Black lives matter. So when you replace all lives matter with Black lives matter, you're not responding to a social reality. There's no history. So there's never been a moment in American history where there was a statement or any kind of law that says all lives do not matter, right? Really, it's just an impossibility. There's never been a moment in U.S. history where it said all lives. You could say, okay, unborn lives don't matter, or Black lives don't matter, or Native lives don't matter. There's never been an all lives do not matter pronouncement by the federal government or any of that sort. So you're not responding to a historical reality saying all lives matter because people have been saying all lives do not matter. Your all lives matter is an instinctual response to assert your privilege, to assert your position. And that is an action out of your brokenness and the internalization of a false reality or a false theology, and you instinctively act out of that. And that's why you need alternative narratives that actually tries and will create a reverse momentum that speaks to the false truths that we have embedded in ourselves. That was a long answer. Woo!
Hey, brother, I just want to, we're going to do, in the interest of time, do one more question, unless I get permission for do one more. But in the meantime, I remember in one of your videos that I watched, did I say I stalked you on Facebook and YouTube? I'm sorry. But you mentioned something so powerful. You said, whose gaze is the authoritative view on everybody else? And you said, when a white male gazes on a Black male, it's either pet, threat. And I love that. It's not my question. I just wanted to say that I love that you said that opportunity to say that that you made that very clear in living a life where that's my reality. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And my career in ministry, if you can call it that, in some ways impends on how I'm viewed, pet or threat. In some areas, man, and in business world, everywhere I go. And I thought that you did a really good job. If you didn't see that video of his, I forgot which one it was, but search that because he makes it very plain.
That's actually in the PowerPoint notes, actually. My apologies, because I realized I was running out of time and I didn't get to that. So if you want to make the PowerPoint available for everybody, they actually have about 3 or 4 additional slides that could be talked about. But that was originally in my notes where I talk about part of privilege is where the dominant culture gets to define other people for themselves, for them. Like they don't get to define themselves, somebody else defines them. And so oftentimes it's the perspective or the point of view of the white male that determines the Black male's role in society. And what I identify is usually it's the pet threat. The Black male is a pet, like the comedian or the rap star or the athlete. And or the African American male is the threat, and I talk about the unidentified Black male as the biggest threat to our society, because you don't know who that person is, but it's a black male. And so every black male now becomes a threat. And so, you know, something like what happened with Tamir Rice. You got a 12-year-old boy. Now, my son was 12 at the time. You had a 12-year-old boy who was shot dead, was shot down within a second of the police getting there because he was deemed a threat. Not because he had a gun. He didn't. They said he had a toy gun, but because he was an unidentified black male. And an unidentified black male was perceived as a threat. So part of that, again, is going to these narratives. Are we willing to hear the stories of black men who tells us a different story than what society is telling us? Society tells us, or the dominant culture gaze tells us, black men are to be used either as a pet, so for your entertainment, or as a threat, as someone who you need to address as a threat to your community, and nothing in between, nothing else. But if you get to know and learn from black men, you realize, wait a minute, what am I doing? Those two things are not the way this person is. And that's where part of the breaking of these broken narratives, the unearthing of these broken narratives can happen.
Okay, very briefly, one last one, and then a question, and then we'll wrap this portion up, being that we got to move on. Man, this is good stuff. By the way, you can accept my friendship on Facebook if you want to.
Okay, all right, I'll look
put that out there.
I maxed out at 5,000 a couple of months ago. So.
Oh, wow. I'm late. I'm sorry. Kick somebody out. No. What responsibility do privileged voices have in this conversation? And how do we understand the responsibility of intersectionality and privilege?
Yeah, privilege. I mean, I kind of addressed this with the Jeremiahs. Jeremiah was one who kind of got out of the way in many cases, and Jeremiah let the women speak, let the most disenfranchised and the broken voices among them speak. And that's why I think it's so important to expand our reading list in the next few years, in the upcoming year. And I'll put a plug in for what we're going to talk about later, the May We Be One program with World Vision, that I just have the great privilege of helping to pull the material together for, and part of the curating of the content. And we're looking to raise up some of these voices that have been previously silenced. And I got to say, one of the things that has really been formative for me is that in the olden days, not in the olden days, but back in the day when they used to talk about racial reconciliation, they would say, find that one black friend, right? Y'all remember this? Kind of the Promise Keeper thing. You join hands and you sing Kumbaya and you hug each other and say, I love you, man. And then you get that one black friend. And I think Chris Rock, or the prophet Chris Rock, put it the best. He said, all the black friends I know have 10 white friends, and all the white people I know have one black friend. So that's the ratio. You got one white friend with 10 white friends and one black friend. And I say that's not bad. Of course, we want to have these cross relationships, but there's still privilege there if you're kind of making that one black friend. What I'm saying more and more is how many of us have non-white mentors? And now is more opportunity to do so. But I would say that in the past, when we have encountered, seminary faculty, and this is changing, thankfully, but in the past, seminary faculty were mostly white. Denominational leadership were mostly white. All the books on how to grow your church were by white folks. And so our influences and our theological shaping and our ecclesial shaping was surrounded by white leaders and mentors. I think this is a moment where we can say, have I had an African-American mentor? Not just a friend, which is good, have many black friends, but do I have a black mentor? Do I have an Asian American mentor or Native American mentor? And that's one of the things that kind of reduces privilege, because even when you're kind of equals as friends, privilege is still around. But when you are under the spiritual authority of someone different from you, that privilege begins to change. And so I've been really blessed with African-American mentors in particular, and Native American friends. And a lot of my academic work was actually with Latino scholars as well as African-American scholars. That changes privilege for me. So I could say, yeah, I got my degrees and I have my doctorates and I have my Ivy League education, but my real education in terms of this ministry of reconciliation has been sitting at the feet of John Perkins, sitting at the feet of Ray Hammond and Gloria Hammond, sitting at the feet of Warren Collins and Bishop Larry Ward and Virginia Ward, and sitting at the feet of Mark Charles and Wendy Peterson and Andrea Smith, and these are Native American scholars, Eldon Viafane. So those are the places where our privilege gets put aside because we're not the teachers, we're the learners. And so I would say, don't look for the one black friend. Yeah, you should have one too, but look for the mentors because at that moment, privilege is handled differently.
Thank you so much, Prophet Rah, or I call you my best friend, Prophet Rah. And
Thank you.
we'll